Owen Caldwell had spent 6 weeks planning his own 40th birthday party, and in the end, it took his wife exactly 90 seconds to turn the whole evening into a funeral. The backyard of their home in Charlotte, North Carolina, United States, was lit with string lights. 53 guests filled the patio. Co-workers from the accounting firm where Owen had worked for 15 years, neighbors from the Dilworth neighborhood, a few of Jillian's friends, and his best friend Reggie Tate, who'd flown in from Denver just for the occasion. There was a jazz trio Owen had hired himself. A tiered cake with buttercream frosting that cost more than it should have, and a toast that never got finished. Because right as Owen raised his glass to thank everyone for coming, Jillian Caldwell and his wife of 12 years stepped forward with a manila envelope and pressed it against his chest. "Happy birthday, Owen," she said, loud enough for the first 3 rows of guests to hear. "You've been served." The silence that followed was so absolute that Owen could hear the jazz bassist quietly lay down his bow. He looked at the envelope, then he looked at his wife, then he looked at her mother, Diane Prescott, standing just behind Jillian's left shoulder with her arms crossed and a smile on her face that could only be described as triumphant. Diane started clapping, slow, deliberate, unique condescending claps that echoed across the yard like gunshots. "It's about time, Diane said. Owen stood there holding the envelope in one hand and a glass of champagne in the other, while the people he loved most watched his marriage end in real time. No one moved, no one spoke. A few guests looked at the ground. His co-worker, Martin, set down his plate and quietly took 2 steps back, as if proximity to the moment might burn him. Reggie took a single step forward, then stopped, unsure what to do. That was the night Owen Caldwell lost everything he thought he had. But what Jillian and her mother didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that Owen Caldwell was a forensic accountant. And forensic accountants don't just find numbers, they find the truth. They had no idea what was coming. If you enjoy stories of cold-blooded revenge and shocking betrayal, I just want to say thank you for being here. Stories like this take a lot of time to find, shape, and bring to life so they can teach and inspire. If this story touched you in any way, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee. Even just $5 helps more than you know. The link is in the description of this video. Thank you for helping these stories continue, and subscribing to the channel would mean a lot as well. To understand how Owen got to that moment on the patio, you have to understand the marriage. And more importantly, you have to understand Diane Prescott. Owen met Jillian in the spring of 2011 at a friend's cookout in the University City neighborhood. She was 25, finishing a master's in communications, sharp and funny and disarming in a way that made Owen feel like he'd known her for years within the first 20 minutes. Owen was 27, already 3 years into his career at Whitfield & Crane, a mid-sized forensic accounting firm in uptown Charlotte. He wasn't flashy. He drove a 10-year-old Honda. He wore the same rotation of 4 suits. But he was meticulous, patient, and quietly brilliant at what he did. They dated for 2 years and got married in a modest ceremony at a vineyard outside Asheville. The wedding was small by Diane's standards, and Diane let everyone know it. During the rehearsal dinner, she'd told Owen's mother, in a voice just loud enough to carry, that Jillian always had champagne taste, and she hoped Owen could keep up. Owen's mother had smiled politely and changed the subject. And Owen had pretended not to hear. Diane Prescott was the kind of woman who measured people by the square footage of their homes and the labels on their handbags. She'd been married to Jillian's father, Gerald, for 31 years before he passed from a heart attack, and she'd spent most of those years spending the money Gerald made as a commercial real estate appraiser. When Gerald died, he left Diane comfortable but not wealthy, and Diane resented the difference. From the beginning, Diane made it clear she thought Jillian had married beneath her. Owen's salary at the time was around $85,000 a year. Respectable, but not the kind of money that impressed Diane Prescott. She wanted Jillian with someone who had presence, someone who drove a car that made a statement, someone whose name opened doors. At every holiday dinner, every birthday, every family gathering, Diane found a way to remind Owen that he wasn't quite enough. A comment about the house being cozy, a raised eyebrow at Owen's car in the driveway, a question about whether Owen had considered something more ambitious with his career. Owen tried to win Diane over for years. He paid for family dinners. He drove Diane to her appointments when her car was in the shop. He even helped her file an insurance claim after a pipe burst in her condo, which as a forensic accountant was significantly beneath his skill set. None of it mattered. Diane's opinion of Owen was fixed from the day they met, and it never budged. But the marriage itself was good, or at least Owen believed it was. The first 8 years were solid. Then they bought a house together in the Dilworth neighborhood, a 3-bedroom bungalow that Owen restored on weekends, replacing the rotted porch boards himself, refinishing the hardwood floors, rebuilding the kitchen cabinets from salvaged oak. They talked about kids, traveled to Savannah and the Outer Banks on long weekends, and built the kind of quiet, steady life that doesn't make headlines, but makes you feel like you've done something right. The shift happened gradually, the way most betrayals do. Around 2022, Jillian started changing. Nothing dramatic at first. She took a new job in marketing at a real estate development firm and began working later hours. She upgraded her wardrobe, designer pieces that appeared in the closet without explanation. She started going to dinners Owen wasn't invited to. Work events, as she called them. She became more critical of the house, the neighborhood, Owen's clothes, the way he spent his weekends restoring furniture instead of networking. "You're 40 years old," she told him one evening, standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed. "Don't you want more than this?" Owen had looked around the kitchen he'd rebuilt with his own hands, and said, "More than what?" She didn't answer. She just shook her head and walked away. Owen noticed the changes, but he told himself it was just stress. Career growth, a new environment. He adjusted. He gave her space. He didn't push. That was his first mistake. By 2023, Jillian and Diane were spending more time together than they had in years. Weekend brunches, shopping trips to South Park Mall. Long phone calls Owen would walk in on that ended the moment he entered the room. Owen would sometimes hear fragments. "He'll never know. Just be patient. It's almost time." He told himself he was being paranoid. That was his second mistake. The third mistake was trusting that the woman he'd given 12 years of his life to would at least have the decency to end things in private. Instead, she chose his birthday. The night of the party, after the guests had scattered in uncomfortable silence, and Reggie had driven Owen to a hotel in Uptown because Owen couldn't bear to sleep in the house, Owen sat on the edge of a hotel bed and opened the envelope. The divorce petition was aggressive. Jillian was claiming irreconcilable differences, which was standard, but the financial demands were not. She wanted the house, which they'd purchased together for $410,000, and which was now worth nearly double that thanks to the Dilworth market. She wanted half his retirement fund. She wanted spousal support of $4,200 a month for 5 years, and she wanted it all processed fast. Her attorney had already filed a motion for expedited proceedings. Owen read the petition 3 times. Then he read it a 4th time with the part of his brain that had spent 15 years tracing hidden money, identifying fraudulent transfers, and catching people in lies they thought were airtight. Something didn't add up. The petition referenced marital assets, but made no mention of Jillian's own income, which at her new job should have been substantial. The financial disclosure was vague in places where it should have been specific. And the expedited timeline was unusual. In North Carolina, there's a mandatory 1-year separation period before a divorce can be finalized. Jillian's attorney was trying to get certain financial agreements locked in before that year even started. Why the rush? Owen closed the envelope and opened his laptop. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he did what he did best. He followed the money. The first thing he found was Jillian's real estate development firm. It was called Hargrove Capital Partners, and it was run by a man named Nolan Hargrove. Owen pulled up the company's public filings, cross-referenced the ownership structure, and then searched Nolan Hargrove's name alongside Jillian's on every platform he could think of. It took less than an hour. There were photos on a company retreat page. Jillian and Nolan standing close at a rooftop event in downtown Charlotte, his hand resting just below the small of her back. There was a LinkedIn recommendation Nolan had written for Jillian that read more like a love letter than a professional endorsement. And there was a property record that made Owen's stomach drop. A luxury condo in the South End neighborhood, purchased 4 months ago for $620,000. The buyer was listed as a trust, But the trust's registered agent was Jillian's maiden name, Prescott. Owen sat back in his hotel chair and let the pieces click together. His wife hadn't just been having an affair. She'd been building a new life with Nolan Hargrove's money under her mother's maiden name, while still legally married to Owen. The birthday party wasn't just cruelty. It was theater. It was designed to humiliate him publicly so he'd be too broken, too embarrassed, and too eager to make the pain stop that he'd sign whatever they put in front of him without looking too closely. They wanted him devastated. They wanted him compliant. But they'd made one critical error. They'd forgotten what Owen Caldwell did for a living. Owen picked up his phone and called Reggie. "I need you to do me a favor," Owen said. "I need you to act like I'm falling apart. Tell anyone who asks that I'm devastated, that I can barely function." "What are you actually doing?" Reggie asked. Owen opened a new spreadsheet on his laptop. "I'm going to work." Over the next 2 weeks, Owen played the part perfectly. He moved into a modest apartment near Noda, let his appearance slip just enough to be convincing, and told his colleagues at Whitfield and Crane that he was going through a rough time. He declined lunch invitations. He left work early twice. He made sure Jillian's friends, the ones who reported back to her, saw a man who looked broken. Meanwhile, in the quiet hours between midnight and 4 a.m., Owen Caldwell was conducting the most important investigation of his career. He started with the money. Nolan Hargrove was 45, divorced once already, and ran a development firm that had built 3 mixed-use projects in the Charlotte metro area over the past decade. On paper, Hargrove Capital Partners looked successful, but Owen had spent enough years reading balance sheets to know that looks successful and is successful are two very different things. He pulled public records. He reviewed permit filings. He traced subcontractor payments through county databases. And what he found was a company that was leveraged to the ceiling. Hargrove had borrowed aggressively to fund his latest project, a 15-story residential tower near the university area. And the project was behind schedule and over budget. Hargrove needed capital, desperately. That's when Owen made the connection he'd been dreading. Owen's uncle, Raymond Caldwell, had passed away in January. Raymond was a retired engineer who'd lived modestly in a cabin near Boone, North Carolina, and who Owen had visited every Thanksgiving for as long as he could remember. Raymond never married, never had children, and never talked about money. But when he died, his estate revealed something no one expected. Raymond had been quietly investing in index funds for 40 years, and the estate was valued at $2.3 million, and Owen was the sole beneficiary. The inheritance was still in probate. Owen hadn't received a dime yet, but Jillian knew about it. She'd been there when the attorney called. She'd seen the paperwork, and she'd told her mother. Owen now understood the timeline. The affair had likely been going on for over a year, but the divorce, the public, humiliating, carefully staged divorce, was timed to the inheritance. Under North Carolina law, inheritance received during marriage could be considered separate property, but if Jillian could get certain financial agreements signed before the inheritance was distributed, she could potentially argue for a larger share of the marital estate. They weren't just leaving Owen, they were trying to rob him. And Diane Prescott, standing in that backyard clapping her hands, had been part of the plan from the beginning. Owen closed his laptop, rubbed his eyes, and stared at the wall of his apartment for a long time. He thought about the 12 years of dinners, the road trips, the quiet mornings on the porch he'd built with his own hands. He thought about the day Jillian had cried on his shoulder when her father died, and how he'd held her for 2 hours without saying a word because he knew she didn't need words. She needed presence. He'd given her everything he had, and she'd turned it into a weapon. Then Owen opened his laptop again and started building the case that would end them all. What Jillian and her mother thought was the end of Owen Caldwell was actually the beginning of the worst chapter of their lives. And they wouldn't see it coming until it was far too late. Owen Caldwell had a rule he followed in every forensic investigation he'd ever conducted. Never let the target know you're looking. The moment they realize someone is pulling at the threads, they start cutting them. So Owen kept his head down, his expression defeated, and his eyes wide open. The first thing he did was hire an attorney. Not just any attorney, but Patricia Holloway, a family law specialist in Charlotte, who had a reputation for being surgically precise in high-asset divorces. Patricia was 51, had practiced for 26 years, and had a framed quote on her office wall that read, "The truth doesn't need volume, it needs evidence." Owen liked her immediately. When he laid out everything he'd found, the affair, when the South End condo purchased under a trust using Jillian's maiden name, the timing of the divorce relative to his uncle's inheritance, and the aggressive financial demands in the petition, Patricia leaned back in her chair and tapped her pen against her notepad 3 times. "They think you're just going to roll over," she said. "That's what I want them to think." "Good." Patricia opened a legal pad. "Let's talk about what we're going to do." The strategy was simple in concept, but required discipline in execution. Owen would cooperate with the divorce process on the surface, attend mediation, respond to filings, appear reasonable. But underneath, he would build an airtight counter case, forensic financial analysis, documentation of the affair, evidence that Jillian had been hiding assets, and proof that the timing of the divorce was a calculated attempt to intercept Owen's inheritance. North Carolina is an equitable distribution state, not a community property state. That meant the court had discretion in dividing assets, and marital misconduct, including adultery, could absolutely factor into alimony determinations. If Owen could prove the affair and the financial deception, Jillian's claim for spousal support would collapse. But Owen didn't just want to win the divorce. He wanted to expose the entire scheme. As we get deeper into Owen's journey through what happened to him, I want to thank everyone who supports this channel. If stories like this move you, if it makes you think, reflect, or see life differently, I'm glad. That's why I spend hours working on them to bring them to you. It takes time, research. Yeah, I ran a lot of work. Just to remind you, if you'd like to support what I do, you can buy me a coffee for just $5 or any amount you feel is right. It truly helps us keep this channel independent and focused on quality storytelling. The link is in the description. Let's see what happened next. Over the next 6 weeks, Owen conducted his investigation with the same methodical precision he brought to every case at Whitfield and Crane. He divided the work into 3 tracks. Track 1 was the affair. Owen needed proof, not suspicion, not circumstantial evidence, but documented, time-stamped, undeniable proof that Jillian had been in a romantic relationship with Nolan Hargrove during the marriage. He hired a licensed private investigator named Walt Jennings, who came recommended by Patricia. DeWalt was a former Charlotte Mecklenburg police detective who now worked exclusively on domestic cases, and he was very, very good at his job. Within 3 weeks, Walt had photographs of Jillian entering Nolan Hargrove's penthouse apartment in the 4th Ward neighborhood on 7 separate occasions, always arriving after 9 p.m. and leaving before 6 a.m. He had GPS data showing that Jillian's car had been parked at Hargrove's building. During nights, she told Owen she was at company retreats or staying at her mother's. And he had a recording, obtained legally in North Carolina, which is a one-party consent state, of a conversation between Jillian and a friend at a coffee shop in which Jillian described Nolan as the man I should have married the first time. Walt also documented something Owen hadn't expected. On 2 of the surveilled evenings, Diane Prescott's car was parked at Nolan's building as well. Not overnight, but for several hours. Diane wasn't just enabling the affair. She was participating in the planning. Walt observed Diane, Jillian, and Nolan sitting together at a restaurant in the Biltmore area, passing papers across the table. Whatever those papers were, the meeting lasted over 2 hours and ended with all 3 of them smiling. Owen studied the surveillance photos late that night in his apartment and felt something shift inside him. Not anger. He'd burned through most of that in the first week. What he felt was clarity, the kind of cold, crystalline focus that came over him when he was deep in a case and the numbers started telling a story the subjects didn't want told. Track 2 was the money. This was Owen's domain, and he attacked it with the focused intensity of someone who had been doing this work for a decade and a half. He started with the South End condo. The trust that purchased it, Prescott Family Holdings, had been established just 8 months ago. The initial capitalization came from a wire transfer of $620,000 from an account linked to Hargrove Capital Partners. The trust's operating agreement listed Diane Prescott as the trustee and Jillian as the sole beneficiary. In plain terms, Nolan Hargrove had bought Jillian a condo and put it in her mother's name to hide it. But that was just the surface. Owen dug deeper. He requested Jillian's financial disclosure through the divorce proceedings, which she was legally required to provide, and cross-referenced it with public records, tax filings, and the information Walt had gathered. The discrepancies were staggering. Jillian had reported her annual salary as $78,000, but Owen found evidence of bonus payments totaling over $145,000 in the past year alone. Payments that went to a personal account Jillian had opened at a different bank, one she'd never disclosed to Owen. The account was in her name only, opened 14 months ago, right around the time the affair appeared to have started. There was more. A luxury SUV registered in Diane's name, but insured on a policy linked to Hargrove Capital Partners. Credit card statements showing purchases at high-end retailers, restaurants, and a jewelry store in the Myers Park area. All paid from accounts Owen had never seen, and a $35,000 deposit into Diane's checking account from the same Hargrove-linked entity made just 2 weeks before the birthday party. Owen suspected that deposit was payment, a reward for Diane's role in orchestrating the public humiliation. Owen laid it all out on a spreadsheet: dates, amounts, sources, destinations, and the pattern was unmistakable. Jillian and Diane had been receiving money from Nolan Hargrove for over a year. They'd hidden it in trusts, separate accounts, and Diane's name. And they'd timed the divorce to grab Owen's inheritance before he even received it. Track 3 was Nolan Hargrove himself. This was where Owen's professional instincts took over completely. He wasn't just looking at Hargrove as his wife's affair partner. He was looking at him the way he'd look at any subject of a forensic investigation, as someone whose financial story might not match reality. And it didn't. Owen spent 3 nights reviewing every public filing associated with Hargrove Capital Partners, building permits, zoning applications, investor disclosures filed with the state, subcontractor lien records, and what emerged was a picture of a company in serious trouble. Hargrove's flagship project, the university area residential tower called the Meridian, was $4.7 million over budget and 11 months behind schedule. 3 subcontractors had filed liens for unpaid work. 2 investors had sent formal demand letters requesting updates on their capital allocation. And the construction loan, held by a regional bank called Pinnacle South Financial, was coming due in 4 months with no extension in sight. Nolan Hargrove wasn't just a cheater. He was a man on the edge of financial collapse, sure using other people's money to maintain the appearance of success while his empire crumbled underneath him. Owen now understood why Hargrove had latched onto Jillian. It wasn't just attraction, it was strategy. If Jillian could secure a significant portion of Owen's inheritance through the divorce, the $2.3 million from Uncle Raymond, that money could flow to Hargrove through the same web of trusts and hidden accounts they'd already built. Hargrove needed that money to save his company. They weren't just having an affair. They were running a con, and Owen had every receipt. The most painful part of the investigation wasn't the financial forensics. It was the moment Owen realized how long it had been going on and how many people knew. Walt's surveillance revealed that Diane had been facilitating the affair from the beginning. She'd given Jillian alibis. She'd helped set up the trust. She'd even attended dinners with Nolan at upscale restaurants in Charlotte while Owen was home watching television, believing his wife was at her mother's book club. Owen also discovered, through a forwarded email chain Walt obtained from a mutual friend who'd grown uncomfortable with the deception, that Jillian had been telling people for months that Owen was emotionally unavailable, boring, and holding her back. She'd been building a narrative, painting herself as the victim of a loveless marriage, laying the groundwork so that, when the divorce happened, the social sympathy would fall on her side. The birthday party stunt was the crown jewel of that strategy. By serving Owen publicly in front of 50 witnesses, Jillian had created a spectacle that positioned her as the bold woman finally breaking free, and Owen as the sad, blindsided husband who never saw it coming. What she didn't account for was that Owen had already seen everything. He just hadn't shown his hand yet. One evening during this period, Owen sat in his apartment with the files spread across his kitchen table. 3 months of investigation, hundreds of pages of records, a story of betrayal so calculated it could have been scripted. He poured himself a glass of bourbon, something he rarely drank, and allowed himself one moment of honest grief. Not for the marriage. That was already dead long before the birthday party. He grieved for the man he'd been, the man who'd tried so hard to be enough, who'd rebuilt a house and a life with his own hands, a man who'd absorbed years of criticism with patience because he believed that's what love required. That man had been naive, and Owen mourned him the way you mourn a friend who didn't make it. Then he finished the bourbon, put the glass in the sink, and went back to the spreadsheets. Grief was a luxury. Owen had work to do. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you would have done in Owen's situation. And kindly support the channel. It was late November 2024 when Owen took a phone call that changed the trajectory of the entire case. The caller was a woman named Vera Hargrove, Nolan's ex-wife. Vera had found Owen's name through Patricia Holloway's office. Patricia had reached out to Vera's divorce attorney as part of the discovery process, and Vera had insisted on calling Owen directly. "When I heard what they did to you at your birthday party," Vera said, "I want you to know that's exactly what Nolan does. He finds the weakness, and he exploits it." Vera told Owen everything. She and Nolan had been married for 9 years before she discovered he'd been having an affair with an investor's wife, while simultaneously embezzling funds from his own company to cover personal expenses. The divorce had been brutal, but Vera had walked away with a settlement and full custody of their 2 children. "He's charming," Vera said, "dangerously charming, and he always has a plan that involves someone else's money." "How did you figure it out?" Owen asked. "I didn't," Vera said, "not until it was almost too late. My forensic accountant found the trail. Nolan creates shell companies like other people create email accounts. Disposable, layered, designed to confuse anyone who looks too closely." Vera gave Owen one more piece of information that would prove decisive. During her divorce, her forensic accountant had identified a specific pattern in Hargrove's business dealings. He routinely created shell entities to move money between personal and business accounts, always naming the LLCs after geographic features. Riverbend Holdings, Summit Point Capital, Crest Ridge Investments. The technique was sophisticated enough to fool most observers, but it left a trail if you knew what to look for. Owen knew exactly what to look for. He went back to the financial records and applied what Vera had described. And there it was. Riverbend Holdings and Summit Point Capital, both registered within the past 18 months, both linked to Hargrove through registered agent records, both used as intermediaries between Hargrove Capital Partners and the Prescott Family Trust. The transfers through these shells totaled over $890,000. Some of the transfers appeared to use investor funds, money that was supposed to be allocated to the Meridian construction project, redirected through the shells and into accounts controlled by Jillian and Diane. It wasn't just an affair. It wasn't just a divorce scheme. It was fraud. Securities fraud, investor fraud, and potentially bank fraud involving the Pinnacle South Financial construction loan. Owen called Patricia. "I found it," he said. "All of it." "How bad?" "Bad enough that Nolan Hargrove isn't going to be worried about my wife anymore. He's going to be worried about staying out of prison." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good. Now let's talk about how we use it." The plan came together over the next 2 weeks. Patricia filed amended responses in the divorce case, formally alleging marital misconduct and hidden assets. She also prepared, but did not yet file, a formal complaint to the North Carolina Securities Division, complete with Owen's forensic analysis and supporting documentation. The mediation was set for early January. Owen had spent 3 months being patient, 3 months letting Jillian and her mother believe he was a broken man shuffling through the motions of a divorce he never wanted. 3 months while they congratulated themselves on their perfect plan. The plan had never been perfect. It had always had one fatal flaw. They'd underestimated Owen Caldwell, and now it was time for them to find out exactly how much. The mediation was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in early January 2025 at a conference room in a law office on South Tryon Street in Charlotte. Jillian's attorney, a sharp, confident litigator named Ross Kavanaugh, had pushed for the meeting, expecting it to be a formality. The assumption on Jillian's side was simple. Owen was broken, Owen was compliant, and Owen would sign. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Owen arrived 10 minutes early wearing a pressed navy suit and carrying a leather briefcase that weighed more than it should have. Patricia Holloway walked beside him, her expression calm, her posture radiating the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what cards she was holding. Reggie had driven Owen to the building that morning and was waiting in the parking garage with a thermos of coffee and a grin he couldn't quite suppress. "You ready?" Patricia asked as they stepped off the elevator. "I've been ready for 3 months," Owen said. Jillian was already in the conference room when they entered. She looked polished. New outfit, new haircut, new confidence. Diane sat beside her, wearing a silk blouse and a satisfied expression, like a woman who'd come to collect a check. Ross Kavanaugh was at the head of the table, legal pad open, pen uncapped, ready to negotiate the terms of what he clearly expected to be a quick and decisive victory. "Good morning," Ross said. "Let's make this productive." "Let's," Patricia said. The first 40 minutes went exactly as Jillian's side expected. Ross laid out the demands: the Dilworth house, half of Owen's retirement fund, $4,200 a month in spousal support, and, buried in a supplemental filing, a claim on any inheritance Owen might receive during the separation period, arguing it should be considered a marital asset because Owen's uncle had died before the separation date. Owen listened to every word. He took notes. He nodded in the right places. He let them finish. Then Patricia opened the briefcase. "Before we respond to the petition," Patricia said, "we'd like to introduce some additional documentation into the record." She slid a thick folder across the table, then another, then a third. Ross Kavanaugh picked up the first folder and opened it. His face changed within 30 seconds. "These are surveillance photographs," Patricia continued, her voice even, "documenting Mrs. E. Caldwell entering and exiting the residence of Nolan Hargrove on 7 separate occasions between August and November of last year. Time-stamped and authenticated by a licensed private investigator." Jillian's composure cracked. Just a hairline fracture, a slight widening of the eyes, a shift in her posture. But Owen saw it. He'd spent 12 years reading that face, and he knew exactly what fear looked like on it. Patricia continued. "The second folder contains financial records, specifically documentation of a trust called Prescott Family Holdings, established 8 months ago and capitalized with $620,000 from an account linked to Hargrove Capital Partners. The trust purchased a condominium in the South End neighborhood. The trustee is Mrs. Diane Prescott. The sole beneficiary is Mrs. Jillian Caldwell." Diane's smile vanished. "The third folder," Patricia said, "contains evidence of undisclosed income. Mrs. Caldwell's financial disclosure lists her annual income as $78,000. However, bank records obtained through proper legal channels show bonus payments totaling $145,000 deposited into a personal account Mrs. Caldwell opened without her husband's knowledge. Additionally, there is documentation of a $35,000 transfer from a Hargrove-linked entity to Mrs. Diane Prescott's personal checking account, made 2 weeks before Mrs. Caldwell served divorce papers at Mr. Caldwell's birthday party." The conference room was silent. Ross Kavanaugh was reading the documents with the focused intensity of a man watching a building collapse in slow motion. Jillian was staring at the table. Diane had gone white. Owen hadn't said a word. Patricia let the silence hold for exactly 5 seconds. Then she delivered the final blow. "We also have evidence," she said, "that Nolan Hargrove used investor funds, money allocated for the construction of a residential development called the Meridian, and routed those funds through shell entities into accounts controlled by Mrs. Caldwell and Mrs. Prescott. The total amount of diverted funds exceeds $890,000. This information has been prepared for referral to the North Carolina Secretary of State's office and the Securities Division, as it constitutes potential securities fraud and investor fraud." Jillian's head snapped up. "You can't—" "We haven't filed the referral yet," Patricia said calmly, "but we are prepared to do so." Ross Kavanaugh closed the folder and looked at his client, and the expression on his face was one Owen had seen before on the faces of defense attorneys in fraud cases. The moment they realize their client hasn't told them the truth. "I need a moment with my client," Ross said. "Of course," Patricia said. "Take your time." Owen and Patricia stepped into the hallway. Owen leaned against the wall, exhaled slowly, and let himself feel the weight of the past 3 months lift from his shoulders. "How are you doing?" Patricia asked. "Better than I've been in a long time." They waited 22 minutes. When the conference room door opened, Ross Kavanaugh stepped out alone. His tie was slightly loosened, and there was a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there an hour ago. "My client would like to know what your terms are," he said. Patricia looked at Owen. Owen straightened his tie. Mosh walked back into the conference room and spoke directly to Jillian for the first time since his birthday. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "I'm keeping the house. I'm keeping my retirement fund. There will be no spousal support. The inheritance from my uncle is my separate property and will remain that way. Any attempt to claim otherwise ends with those fraud referrals being filed by close of business today." Jillian opened her mouth. Diane grabbed her arm. "I'm not finished," Owen said. "The condo in South End, the one Nolan bought you, is going to be liquidated, and the proceeds will be placed in an escrow account pending the outcome of any investor claims against Hargrove Capital Partners. You will sign an affidavit acknowledging the undisclosed accounts and the financial deception. And the divorce will proceed on my terms, not yours." He paused. The room was so quiet he could hear the ventilation system humming. "You chose to humiliate me in front of 50 people on my birthday. You chose to stand there and clap." He looked at Diane. "You thought I was too broken to fight back. You were wrong." Diane, for the first time Owen could remember, had nothing to say. Jillian's voice was barely above a whisper. "Owen, "Save it," Owen said. "You don't get to explain. You get to sign." They signed. But the reckoning didn't end in that conference room. Within a week of the mediation, Owen's findings regarding Hargrove Capital Partners reached exactly the people they needed to reach. Patricia Holloway, with Owen's approval, forwarded the financial documentation to the two lead investors in the Meridian project. And those investors, one a retired executive from Atlanta and the other a family office based in Raleigh, had collectively put $3.1 million into the development. When they saw where their money had actually gone, they hired their own forensic team and filed a civil lawsuit against Nolan Hargrove within 15 days. The Pinnacle South Financial construction loan, $6.2 million, was called due immediately when the bank reviewed the fraud allegations. Hargrove couldn't pay. The Meridian project was frozen. Subcontractors who had already filed liens began pursuing judgments. The entire development, which was supposed to be Nolan Hargrove's crowning achievement, became a monument to his greed. Nolan Hargrove's law license, he'd passed the bar years ago but never practiced, was placed under review. Or his real estate development license was suspended pending investigation, and the North Carolina Securities Division opened a formal inquiry into the movement of investor funds through shell entities. Nolan tried to call Jillian. She didn't answer. He tried to call Diane. Diane changed her number. By late February, Jillian Caldwell, soon to be Jillian Prescott again, was living in her mother's two-bedroom condo in the Ballantyne area of Charlotte. The South End condo was in escrow. The hidden bank accounts were frozen as part of the investor lawsuit. The luxury SUV had been voluntarily surrendered, and the life she thought she'd been building with Nolan Hargrove had evaporated like morning fog on a highway. That's when the begging started. Diane called first. Not Jillian. Diane. She called Owen's phone at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday evening in early March, and Owen let it ring 4 times before answering. "Owen," Diane said, and her voice sounded nothing like the woman who had clapped at his birthday party. "We need to talk." "No," Owen said, "we don't. Jillian is struggling. She made a terrible mistake. She knows that now. If you could just—" "Diane," Owen said quietly, "you stood in my backyard and applauded while your daughter destroyed my life in front of everyone I cared about. You helped plan it. You helped fund it. You smiled." Diane was silent. "I don't owe you a conversation," Owen said, "and I don't owe Jillian a second chance. What I owe myself is the peace I should have demanded a long time ago." He hung up. Jillian tried a different approach. She wrote Owen a letter, handwritten, 4 pages, delivered to his office at Whitfield and Crane. In it, she described her regret, her confusion, how Nolan had manipulated her, how Diane had pushed her toward the affair and the financial scheme. She said she'd lost herself. She said she still loved Owen. She said she was willing to do anything to make it right. Owen read the letter once, folded it neatly, and placed it in the file alongside the surveillance photos, the bank records, and the trust documents. Then he went back to work. The divorce was finalized in late April 2025. Owen kept the Dilworth house. He kept his retirement fund. The inheritance from Uncle Raymond, $2.3 million after taxes and probate fees, remained entirely his. No spousal support was awarded. The court, having reviewed the evidence of marital misconduct and financial deception, ruled decisively in Owen's favor. Jillian walked out of the courtroom with nothing but what she'd brought into the marriage, and significantly less dignity than she'd had before. Nolan Hargrove settled the investor lawsuit for an undisclosed amount, though sources close to the case suggested it was nearly everything he had left. The Meridian project was sold to a competing development firm for pennies on the dollar. Nolan's name, once associated with Charlotte's real estate boom, became a cautionary tale in local business circles. Diane Prescott spent the spring and summer dealing with the consequences of her involvement. The $35,000 she'd received from Hargrove's accounts was clawed back as part of the investor settlement. Her role in establishing the fraudulent trust became part of the public record. Two of her closest friends stopped returning her calls. The social standing she'd spent decades cultivating, the brunches, the charity galas, the carefully curated image of a respectable widow, crumbled like wet paper. Owen didn't celebrate any of it. That surprised him. He thought he'd feel triumphant. He thought destroying the people who'd tried to destroy him would feel like victory, clean and satisfying and final. Instead, it felt like finishing a very long, very difficult audit. The numbers balanced, the truth was documented, the case was closed, but there was no joy in it, just relief. Reggie flew in from Denver for a weekend in May, and the two of them sat on Owen's back porch, the same porch where the birthday party had happened, drinking beers and watching the sunset paint the sky over the Dilworth rooftops. You could sell this place, Reggie said. Start fresh somewhere. Owen shook his head. I built this porch with my own hands. I'm not letting anyone take that from me, not anymore. He took a long sip of his beer. I spent 12 years trying to be enough for people who never thought I was. Jillian wanted someone richer. Diane wanted someone flashier. Nolan wanted someone else's wife and someone else's money. None of them ever saw me, the actual me. They saw what they could get from me. And now? Now I see myself, Owen said, and that's enough. The following autumn, Owen received an unexpected email from Vera Hargrove. She'd heard through the legal grapevine that the divorce was finalized and wanted to check in. I hope you found the peace you were looking for, she wrote, and I know what it's like to come out the other side of something like this. It changes you. But if you let it, it changes you for the better. Owen wrote back a brief reply, thanking her for the information that had helped him uncover the fraud. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. He was in a new chapter now. Owen continued his work at Whitfield and Crane, but something had shifted. The same skills that had saved him, the patience, the precision, the ability to find truth in a sea of deception, now felt like more than just a career. They felt like a calling. He began mentoring younger forensic accountants at the firm, teaching them not just how to trace money, but how to recognize the human patterns behind financial manipulation. Or people lie with numbers the same way they lie with words, he told a group of new hires during an orientation session. They hide things in complexity. They bet on the fact that you won't look closely enough. Your job is to always look closer. He also started restoring furniture again on weekends, something he'd given up during the last years of his marriage because Jillian thought it was beneath them. He refinished the dining table he'd built 6 years earlier, sanded down to the original grain, and gave it a new coat of finish that made the wood glow. He put it back in the dining room and ate dinner at it every night. Some evenings, sitting at that table with a book and a glass of wine, Owen thought about the birthday party. He thought about the envelope against his chest, the clapping, the silence. And he realized that the worst night of his life had also been the night that saved him, because it forced him to stop pretending that a comfortable lie was the same thing as a good life. It wasn't. A good life, Owen had learned, wasn't about being enough for someone else. It was about being honest with yourself, about who you are, what you deserve, and what you're willing to accept. Owen Caldwell had spent 12 years accepting less than he deserved. He'd accepted the criticism, the dismissal, the quiet erosion of his self-worth by people who saw him as a stepping stone rather than a partner. He wasn't accepting that anymore. The lesson Owen carried forward wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about winning. It was simpler and harder than that. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is let people face the consequences of their own choices. Not out of cruelty, not out of anger, but because the truth, once it's out, doesn't need your help to do its work. It just needs you to get out of the way. Owen Caldwell got out of the way, and the truth did the rest. If you enjoyed this story, like this video and leave a comment telling me what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please subscribe. If you want to support the work behind the video, you can buy me a coffee. Link is in the description below. Even $5 makes a big difference. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.